Welcome back to Kings of the North, here to talk about, discuss, celebrate, contextualize the first Northern Football National Championship in 9 years, just the third Northern Football National Championship in the last 25 years. I'm Doug Lesmerises, along with Bill Landis, our producer, Mike Urosowski alongside. And Bill, this was a huge night for Northern football. As we said, in the last 25 years, the only other two national championships for the North, Ohio State in 2002, Ohio State in 2014. What did you think of the game that was played, the level of performance that we saw? Oh, no. You made a face. No dog mentality. There's nobody is coming on it. Well, if Georgia would have.
Why would I do that? Why
you made a face? We have to be truthful. How do you think they played?
I thought Michigan's defense played great. Yeah. It was a little bit of a clunker, but we've seen clunky national championships before. It was weird to see kind of things that had not happened all year. For example, Michigan being explosive, running the ball, Michael Penix missing not a bunch of open receivers, like missing throws that he normally makes. Certainly would not have anticipated that going into the game, and that sort of like changed the tenor of things for me. But I really did think Michigan's defense played an excellent game and gave Washington some problems. So like that was like kind of my biggest takeaway. Of course, it's not the prettiest game. There's no guarantee that it would have been a pretty game. I don't care who you put into it, but like a physical game, I thought, and one where Michigan sort of like did what it's done, I think, in most of its big games this year, which is like do enough on offense and then kind of put the game in the hands of its defense.
So this is the 144th season of Michigan football. This is the 12th national championship for Michigan football. This is the 10th season where they claimed a national championship with an undefeated, untied record. 1901, 1902, 1904, 1918, 1923, 1932, 1947, 1948, and 1997, the previous 9 years where they were undefeated, untied, and the national champion. This is the greatest year of Michigan football ever. Yeah. Season 144 is the greatest year for Michigan. I don't know if anybody who watched the 1902 Michigan Wolverines wants to dispute that, but certainly they never went 15-0 before. It's interesting how much all of us got caught up in the lack of schedule strength early on, the non-conference schedule. There wasn't much there. You kind of were waiting for Michigan to get tested. It didn't really happen at all till they played Penn State. And then they sort of had to play one-handed against Penn State because they had offensive line problems. They barely threw the ball. And then they obviously got a real test from Ohio State. We are going to get into the specifics of the legacy of this team and Jim Harbaugh and what's next and how we will look back on the totality of this Michigan season and this Michigan era. We will wrap up with that, but we're mostly going to talk about football off the top. But this idea, Bill, this is on the field. I mean, this is one of the better seasons that you'll find, I think, anybody put out there in recent college football history. And I think along the way, a lot of people sort of wound up underrating Michigan all along the way, A, because their schedule was weak, and B, because of the sign stealing things that came out. And then you try to factor in how much that was part of their success. But I think, again, we don't want to, that's not where we're going first, but you think about what they did since then, post that, once all that came out, the way they played the games they won. This is an excellent football team.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably easiest to try to look at that through the lens of a Michigan fan, right? Because I get it's complicated otherwise, but if you can put yourself in those shoes for a second, right? Yes, they did not play the toughest schedule in the world in the beginning of the season, but we talked about how they were historically dominant against that kind of subpar schedule early in the year. So they like more than handled their business there. And then when the test came, they performed. Like they didn't always play their best games when those tests came, but they found ways to win. And yeah, I don't. We'll see what happens, right? For I guess for ultimately how this team is remembered. But for folks in Ann Arbor and Michigan fans, kind of anywhere in the world, this is an all-timer to be sure.
We certainly understand that we have a heavy Ohio State audience here on Kings of the North. You and I have been covering Ohio State football for our college football reporting careers, and so there's one of these things. It's like I want everybody. It's like we're in the North. Everybody love everybody. We get that. right? But I think there's something that every team in the North that may face more recruiting hurdles than some teams in the South, that may not always have the number of explosive playmakers, right? I do think there are some things here that should buoy those programs and think, okay, when Georgia won the national championship the last couple of years, and again, that was a defense-heavy team, but sometimes you look at the NFL guys that Georgia put out there, and by the way, Michigan's gonna have a bunch of guys go to the NFL draft, but you thought to yourself, "Well, I don't know, we can't beat Georgia." Sometimes you would look at you look at LSU in 2019, it's like, all you gotta do is get Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase and Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Joe Burrow, and you're good to go. It's like, well, we can't do that. I'm not at all saying that this is easy, but this is well coached. This is machine-like. This is much more about a roster 1 through 44, 1 through 60 than it is about the best 5 guys.
Mhm.
There are parts of this when I watch what Michigan did. This is why Iowa had to fire Brian Ferentz, because there's a world where it's like, listen, man, I'm telling you, brother, play great defense, do some real stuff on the offensive line, and call a smart game. You don't have to have first-round receivers. You know what I'm saying? Like, you have to have, complimentary. Anybody that's like complimentary football, this is it. Kirk Ferentz, Iowa is not complimentary football, because when they say it, complimentary is another word for we suck at one thing.
Right.
This is be good at everything. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but I think there's a game plan here in roster building, in coaching, in scheme, in the way you attack things, because previously the last 2 years with Michigan, it beats Ohio State. It wins in November in the North, but is it going to win indoors? Is it going to win when it's warm? Is it going to win against the SEC? And everything before was, but this is yes. And I think it proves that other Northern teams can try to do this. It's going to be hard, but it's easier than trying to beat Georgia. And 2, the thing that's been beating everybody in the North, you don't have to take a back seat and say, well, we can't even beat Michigan. You know what I mean? Which I think there's part of that for Ohio State. It's like, well, Michigan can beat Ohio State, but can Michigan go? This Michigan formula beat everybody. Could beat everybody. Absolutely could have, would have beaten Georgia. And I think in some way, as frustrating as that is, especially for Ohio State fans, Ohio State played Michigan to the final minute. Michigan just won the national title. There's a part of you that, as an Ohio State fan, anybody who makes you feel sick. But on the other hand, it's like, well, I don't know, man. Like, are you 2 plays away from this being you? So I think there's a lot here that is hopeful and possibly replicable for the North. Can anybody else be Michigan?
I don't know. I don't disagree with the part about it being replicable. I don't know if that's an Ohio State conversation necessarily.
No, that's the problem. Not Ryan Day. If Ryan Day was listening, ignore that. Ohio State should not try to be Michigan. Right. I think almost everybody else in the North, Washington is doing it the Ohio State way. Let Washington and Ohio State chuck it around. Everybody else in the North, though, don't try to be Ohio State and Washington. Try to be Michigan.
Yeah, I think there were well-founded reasons that Matt Rule, like in the middle of the year, said he was trying to make Nebraska into Michigan, right? So I think, like, you think about a program like that, you think about Wisconsin, Oregon. I don't know. Oregon maybe is more trying to do it the Ohio State way. But I think there's probably a handful of programs in the North that maybe feel like it's been a little hopeless for them. And it's not to say that it would be easy, but there is a recipe here that I do feel like those teams can strive for. And it doesn't guarantee them a national championship, but I think maybe it puts them in more positions to take a run at one, to make a 12-team playoff. And then who knows what happens, right? I don't know if we've thought about those kind of programs in the North along those lines before tonight, but I do think there's something to grab onto here and kind of hold on to that hope as we move forward into this new era where access is a little easier. Yeah. Not to say that not that winning the games on the field becomes any easier, but access to play for a championship is easier. And I think there's something to the recipe that Michigan put forward.
Because that was all the thing. Yeah, you can get in, but can you win? Yeah, you can get in. But
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's going to get in. What are you going to do with it? Well, they just did this. So again, if you missed the very beginning, we're going to talk about Jim Harbaugh, the legacy of this season, what's next, what it means, how we'll look at it. Obviously, there's people who are going there right now. We're going to do that to end the show. We want to talk about the football on the field, and I want to start with the Michigan offense. And in 2021, Josh Gaddis was the play caller for Michigan, but Sherrone Moore, that was his first year as the co-offensive coordinator and the offensive line coach. Previously, he'd been the tight end coach. Michigan has sweeping changes with its assistant coaching staff after the terrible 2020 COVID year. Sherrone Moore slides over as now the offensive line coach. Josh Gaddis gets a lot of praise that year, wins the Broyles Award as the best assistant in college football. There's precision. There's beauty to the way Michigan runs the ball and gets after you. Josh Gaddis leaves, goes to Miami, flames out. Was it Maryland this year? And
Yes.
Sherrone Moore is still there. Sherrone Moore is still there. And the early drives, Bill, in this game, where you saw Michigan go jumbo on one side, and then there's a cutback hole for Donovan Edwards on the other side. I think at the Blake Corum run, the 50-yarder, Drake Nugent, second level on a guy. Trente Jones, right tackle, second level on a guy. Colston Loveland, second level on a guy. The three big Michigan runs early reminded me of the Blake Corum 50-yard run in the second half of the 2021 Ohio State-Michigan game, where you could freeze that play and you could see like 7 perfect blocks on 7 Ohio State Buckeyes. And I'm freezing. I'm taking pictures with my cell phone. Perfect block, perfect block, perfect block. And it's Sherrone Moore. It's Sherrone Moore and it's Jim Harbaugh, because the guy who got credit for it in 21 left and they're better at it. And there is like precision to that. I was trying to think about it. It's almost like Michigan at its best is kind of like a music box with all those gears, and it's like ding, 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 ding. But guess what? A lot of gears, a lot of delicate parts. Sometimes it breaks. It's hard to be necessarily consistent, but when it goes right, it's beautiful. Washington to me is like a little more like a Jack in the Box, right? Like a ding, 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 boing, right?
Yeah.
And it shoots up, and it's but like, and I always had a Jack in the Box when I was a kid that would scare the crap out of me. But sometimes it wouldn't pop up at all, which almost made it worse, because it was like, oh, it's broken, it's not popping up. And then when it's Roma Dunze, boing, then it really scares you.
Yeah.
The precision in the first half of that Michigan offense, it's beautiful violence, is it not? I mean, is it not? If in your version of the afterlife, right? Would you just want to watch offensive linemen getting to the second level and making perfect blocks? That when they do that as well as anybody in the country does anything. And they did it enough in the first half to get a lead, even though Washington made some adjustments.
Yeah. I mean, it was what I think maybe people who had an idea of Michigan in their head, but maybe didn't watch a bunch of Michigan this year, they probably assumed Michigan was this year. And in all actuality, they weren't that.
They weren't.
If you look at like stuff like second level yards and just like general explosiveness running the ball, they struggled mightily all year to block things that perfectly, that consistently, to get Donovan Edwards especially, but Blake Corum also to the second level, and then have those guys run away from people. It just wasn't syncing up that way for them all year. And then I think they got a little lucky on the first Donovan Edwards run. He like kind of tried to run up the butt of his offensive lineman, and like no one tackled him. And then he's like, "Oh, I guess I'll just go this way." And there was nobody there.
But like the hole, that outside hole was kind of there for like 9 seconds. He just didn't see it.
He just didn't see it right away.
He saw his lineman's butt instead.
Yeah, but then the second one, he made like a devastating cut and found the hole right away and scored in impressive fashion. And then Blake Corum's long run was great too. That was like that was quintessential Michigan for me. That was everything that Jim Harbaugh and Sherrone Moore and that offensive line want to be. And I thought it was like a good little nugget that they dropped during the game about like when Sherrone Moore took over, he locked the offensive line in the room and told them they have to be the engine that moves the team forward or something like that. Like they had to be the thing that makes Michigan football go if they were ever going to get back to what they want it to be. And I think if you're being fair, this offensive line at times throughout the season was not that. But when it needed to be in the national championship game, it sure was. And even in the game itself, it wasn't all that consistent. Both the execution and the play calling, I think, got a little weird. I felt like they could have just lined up in unbalanced sets and ran the ball down Washington's throat all game if it wanted to. But that didn't really happen. But the two long Donovan Edwards runs and then the Blake Corum on top of it, I think it was 176 rushing yards in the first quarter. Just like was not expecting it at all. but it's like that's Michigan's identity to a T right there.
And then the play action stuff that it does help set up. I'm
Mhm.
always like the guy, you don't need to run the ball to do play action, but actually, like when you run the ball like Michigan does, I do think you can actually see it set up
Yeah.
their play action. And then again, like JJ McCarthy maybe doesn't want. I think we would definitively say does not really wind up being the quarterback that maybe people expected. I know he's fifth on Mel Kiper's draft chart. I don't know who he is. Sometimes they say that, and I say, really? I'm not exactly sure how it fits, but like in the right offense where you do roll him out, run some play action, let him use his legs smartly at times. But he winds up being sort of like what they need. The scramble's huge, right? Everybody on Twitter is
Yeah.
saying, why aren't they using him in the run game? Why aren't they using him in the run game? Then he scrambles for 30 yards and a first down. Then they follow it up with a designed run, and he winds up with like 45 yards in 2 plays. And it's like, okay, here are the legs coming into play. But then I think this showed up, and I think there's like precision in their DNA, even if it doesn't show up all the time. And I think that can be in a season. I think it can be in a game, in the midst of a game. It can be in the midst of a season. But when they need it, when they need that callback, the fact that they got that drive at the end of the semifinal against Alabama, this is it. Money drive. They drive for a touchdown. Here, Washington's coming back. Michigan hasn't done anything for 2 quarters. Money drive, right? I mean, that to me shows that they still have that ability that's taught, right? And it's trained into
Yeah.
them by Sherrone Moore and this offense that they can conjure it when they need to. And I do think if JJ McCarthy wasn't the Heisman candidate, wasn't the big stats thrower that we thought, I do think he kind of wound up. I mean, they won the national championship. He kind of wound up being what this team needed. Now, if you would have had a team that needed much more as a thrower, then maybe I don't know. But I think leadership, motivation, guts, right? And then by the way, every now and then rip. What was the best throw of the night? I mean, the most well-executed pass probably of the whole night is the crosser to Colston Loveland that catch and run for like 40 yards. That was and it was a little high, but he made a nice catch. But I mean, like that
Yeah.
was in rhythm, bang, here we go. He has that in him too. So I do think some of the stuff with the Michigan offense, it wasn't always on display, but it was always in there. And they really, I think, managed to conjure it when they needed it the most, which is you don't shrink when you need it the most, you rise up when you need it the most. And it obviously got him a lead, and then it also put the game away tonight.
Yeah, that's kind of what we talked about after the Rose Bowl, right? Like there's just this really real sense of belief from Michigan that if they stick to what they do, they'll figure it out. They'll get enough, right? I don't know if they consume themselves with getting as much as they possibly can on offense. Like they're not going out there looking to put up a 40 burger every night. They don't need 500 yards of offense. They are content with doing whatever is required of them on that particular day on the offensive side of the ball, and they trust that even if there's some hiccups in the course of the game, they'll find the couple of drives they need to find to get what they need. And I thought that this was another example of that. Now it leads to like not always being pretty and some head scratching moments. And like, I don't know that JJ is necessarily a precision passer, but he's got a pretty freaking strong arm and he's an incredible athlete. So he's still going to make you, I think, 4 or 5 really important plays per game, whether it's the scramble, I thought the play action pass to was it the Roman Wilson on the sideline was a great throw. Like the design run he had right after the scramble. Like there was, again, it's not all game. He's not making a highlight reel, but he's doing what he needs to do when the moment arises. And like, if it was a different game where Washington's able to do a little more offensively and maybe more is asked of JJ, maybe he's not quite capable of getting there, but I do think like that speaks to the complementary thing you were talking about earlier, right? There's a belief in the whole program that they're all going to do kind of their job to pick each other up and mask whatever shortcomings might be on either side of the ball.
And as long as they can play their way, they're in really good shape. And nobody was able to sort of make them play in a way that's like, now they're down 2 scores. Now what are they going to do? JJ McCarthy, 10 of 18, 140 yards, also ran it 4 times for 31, Blake Corum, 21 carries for 134 and 2 touchdowns. Donovan Edwards, 6 carries for 104 and 2 touchdowns. Colston Loveland, the leading receiver, 3 for 64. Roman Wilson, 3 for 54. You and I talked about the Donovan Edwards factor, I think, before the Alabama game. Didn't really happen. Happened here. Man, when that guy's like your second back, holy moly, there's some explosion. And again, like, wasn't really there this year, but kind of was always in the DNA. So there was really a blueprint, which again, I think maybe helped throw some people off. I know there are people who picked Michigan to win the national title before the year. And then I think, as much as I was saying, hey, did we underrate them? Did the assessment of Michigan get thrown off by the sign stealing, by the schedule? But also there were times when they didn't look as good as they did in the previous 2 years when it came to being as dominant running the ball as they had been. But I thought this was a good display of Michigan's offense tonight. Not down after down, quarter after quarter, but enough. And I think that was appropriate as well. Let's talk about the defense. Was Michael Penix off, or did Michigan force Michael Penix to be a little bit off?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I early I kind of thought it was more about Penix being off, and then like as the game progressed, I think I just gained a little bit more of an appreciation for how much Michigan was making him feel uncomfortable. And they got like decent pressure with their defensive line. I thought like they only sacked them a couple times, but they hit him a few times, which I think throws Michael Penix off his game a little bit. And you're not used to seeing Michael Penix like hitch or pump fake or like look hesitant at all when he's back there. And I think that's a byproduct of like Jesse Minter and that secondary doing a really good job of disguising things, switching things up after the snap, being a little less predictable. So I think I leave the game thinking that it was a little more of Michigan kind of forcing the issue than it was Michael Penix being off. But maybe that's just because I want to tip my cap to the team that won. But like clearly Michael Penix did miss some throws that he normally makes. But I thought he was confused, maybe as confused as I've seen him look against any defense Washington has faced this year.
Seemed like two things, right? Jesse Minter, good job of simulated pressure at times. I thought they were speeding him up without actually bringing 5 and 6 guys. They were bringing 4 or 3 sometimes, and he was getting the ball out of there like he was being pressured. Obviously, the big shot to Odunze that they missed. I know there was some discussion on social media of, is that actually a corner route that Odunze was so open, he kind of flattened it out and kept going, and Penix threw more toward the sideline as a corner route. Like, it looks like a miss. And is it like, actually, hey, why didn't you do the thing that you were supposed to do? But he was, I thought, like legitimately high on a couple things. And I thought in general, they just sped him up without being too risky. Right now, I did think there was a blitz late in the game where I think when it was still a game, I thought where they like zero blitzed and he got it out quick to Jalen McMillan, and Mike Sainristil still made an open field tackle. And I think if he can break that tackle, I think it's a touchdown.
He would have scored.
Like there's nobody else on that side of the field at all. And there were a couple moments. That was a matchup that you keyed in on, Jalen McMillan versus Mike Sainristil. I think you even saw early, right? The only touchdown pass that Michael Penix threw. It's like, okay, Will Johnson's covering Rome Odunze. He grabs him, gets a flag. Mike Sainristil is covering Jalen McMillan. Jalen McMillan beats him off the line inside wide open. And it's like, okay, 2 best receivers, 2 best cover guys when it matters in the red zone on 4th down, both Washington receivers win. It's like, okay, well, but I do think they covered well enough, simulated pressure. And then, by the way, the Michigan defensive tackles are a freaking load, brother.
Yeah, they kind of own things. Like Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham in particular, but like Chris Jenkins had a really good play on a Penix run where he like came down the like screaming down the line and tackled Penix for like kind of like no gain. They played great. They kind of dominated there, and I think like it's hard for any quarterback when like the middle of the pocket is just kind of always collapsing on you, and it did feel that way at times. I thought too, like, if you want to be fair, and I'm not necessarily trying to say like the refs had a bad game or whatever, Michigan's defensive backs were kind of handsy, and they got away with it. Like they were physical with Washington's receivers in a way that I think made Washington's receivers uncomfortable, and probably a way that Washington's receivers had not been played a whole lot this year. And it was effective. But I also want to point out that they probably got away with a grab or 5 in that game that maybe a different officiating crew might have called, and maybe things would have gone differently had they done so.
I mean, it felt like at least there was one they showed was like maybe even a couple run plays. Michigan's offensive linemen were getting a little handsy there,
Mhm.
but again, there's some of the stuff I did think it's mostly the interior guys. I thought Braden McGregor he made one of the bigger plays of the game because he beats Roger Rosengarten, right? The right tackle for Washington on the first deep ball to Odunze that would have been like a 32-yard gain, draws a holding penalty. It's not a blitz. It's a typical 4-man pressure, and he just wins with an easy inside move and forces a holding call. I know like Herbie kind of was like, is that really holding? And I think some people expressed that in a world where there was some grabbing during the course of the game. I thought it was the right call to
Yeah.
call that. But even I thought there were just enough times where Michigan did enough. They only sacked him once, one sack in the game, and Penix winds up 27-51 for 255, 1 touchdown, 2 picks. Again, the key with Michigan does just enough. And I do think there's something there of you always think that Michigan has the ability to do something, I think, on both sides of the ball. Well, we know they can run the ball. We know they can get pressure. We know they can cover. That even when they don't, the possibility that they can affects you. Like it's hard to find a consistent weakness with this Michigan team. Doesn't mean they're perfect every snap, but I think this defense, and this is what we sort of talked about. I thought Penix would something closer to have his way, and that Michigan would have to find a formula to win anyway. I mean, he didn't have his way. I mean, they made it very difficult on him, and it's that combination of they have enough guys in the back end who can cover that they believe in, and they have enough guys up front, and then they have a really good defensive coordinator scheming it up, and like those three things. Usually one of the three was working,
Yeah.
right? And that's enough to keep, I would say, the best quarterback in college football, the best thrower of the ball in college football, off balance, off his game. And I think that contributes to some of the high throws, some of the shots they showed in the game where a guy's open, he doesn't get it to him because he feels like he's under pressure, even if he's not.
Yeah, those plays were maybe among the most important, like the quick checkdowns he would take to either a back or a tight end that weren't even necessarily failures of plays. Like they might still get 6-7 yards, but was there something down the field where you could have gotten 30 yards that you didn't even bother to look at because you thought you were getting pressured? Like it makes me almost want to go back and like count those instances up to see how often Michael Penix ended up kind of getting baited into those throws, because it did feel like it happened quite a bit. It also felt like I wasn't watching the all 22, so maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like a lot of times when you watch Washington, you're just watching like snap after snap of guys running wide open,
Yeah.
and that didn't seem like it was happening against me. Like there were plays for sure that I can recall. Sometimes Penix made the throw, sometimes he didn't, but um, I think I said going into the game, like Michigan's defense just doesn't feel like one that's going to allow itself to get manipulated that way, even if it means like playing a little conservatively at times. And I thought that showed up. Like they were in pretty good position, I thought, and it felt like they were putting Washington's receivers in positions to have to make tough catches on like anything that was down the field. There were some easier like underneath check down stuff, I guess, but if Michael Penix was trying to push the ball down the field, which frankly didn't happen all that often, it did feel like Michigan was doing a really good job of making sure it wasn't out of position on those plays.
So for anyone who didn't catch us live at the beginning, we were talking about what this means for Northern football. And I want to contextualize this a little bit more now. Mike, we have a graphic on this. This is in the last 25 years, starting in 1998, it's the third Northern title. In the last 50 years, I believe it is the 14th season in which a Northern team claimed a national championship. And we can put that up, Mike. And I think that's really important because, there was a time, and we'll go back, right? We'll go back in the archives eventually in the offseason and that kind of thing, where we are talking about Army and we're talking about like great Northern teams of long ago in a world where college football used to be centered in the North, and it's not that way anymore. But I do think For Michigan to win this in 2023, we're talking about Ohio State in 2014. We're talking about Ohio State in 2002, and that's in the last 25 years. Then previous to that, we're talking about 1997. Last time Michigan won, they split the national title with Nebraska. Then we're back into that little Nebraska mini dynasty. They win it in 94. They win it in 95. Then we're back to Washington in 1991, right, where they end up splitting a national title. Now we're getting back right into all the splits in national title history. 1990, Colorado splits a national title. Now we're back to some of the previous perennial Northern powers. Notre Dame in 1988, Penn State in 1986, BYU with their little blip in 1984, Penn State in 1982, Notre Dame in 1977, and Pitt in 1976. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Again, Bill, it's like the previous 25 years, we had 11 seasons in which a Northern team won or shared a national title, 11 of those 25. Now this last 25, we have 3.
Yeah.
So it's 14 instances in the last 50 years where a Northern team can claim at least a little bit of it. I don't know that we're going to cycle into 19 Northern titles in the next 25 years of the sport, but I do think we can and will cycle into something more like 11 in 25 years than 3 in 25 years. And I think that should be, we could lay this down as a goal. Will Kings of the North be on 25 years from now? I mean,
of course.
Probably. Almost like 92% chance that Kings of the North will be celebrating its silver anniversary 25 years from now. But is that like a reasonable goal? We're not, maybe not getting back to the 40s, but getting back like to the 70s, 80s, and 90s when the North was in that mix every other year, basically.
Yeah, I think so. It goes back to some of the roster building conversations we had last week, kind of leading into this game. Like, I don't think there's any expectation that all of a sudden a bunch of Northern teams are going to start recruiting the way that Alabama and Georgia do. But can you maximize whatever your ceiling is with high school recruiting and supplement it with transfers and kind of strike when you're older the way that Washington did this year? I do think that's a winning recipe for a lot of programs in the North who can be opportunistic, excuse me. And that's not even to say, like, of course, Ohio State's always going to be there. I think Oregon's going to be in this conversation moving forward too, with the way that they're recruiting. Michigan, we'll see. We'll talk about what's going to happen with Michigan as we move forward here. But I think when you have a program or two, or maybe 3, if you want to include USC in that conversation, since it's a Big Ten team, moving forward, if you can have like a couple of programs like that just sort of by inherently who they are going to build their rosters in a way where they're competing for national championships, and then another 3 to 5 every couple of years that are going to do something like what we saw Washington do this year, I don't think it's unreasonable to think we could be closer to the 11 than to the 3. Or will it be 11 exactly? I don't know. Maybe I end up picking something more like 8, but even then, that's still a drastic improvement of what we've seen over the last 25 years.
And this is an off-season conversation. We'll look 25 years in the future and say, like, what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? What's the threshold for success? But I think Notre Dame should watch this Michigan team and think, okay, let's try to do that. I think Penn State should watch this Michigan team and say, okay, let's try to do that. You already talked about Nebraska. You know, could Utah look at this Michigan team? I mean, in a lot of ways, I think they try to do that already, but we think Utah could go be the best team in the Big 12, go be the Michigan of the Big 12. And then what does that mean? Take your shot when you get to the 12-team playoff. So I think it doesn't mean that Indiana is going to follow the Michigan model to a national championship, but I do think the top level of the North.
Kurt Signetti short,
now, man. Why would I pull Indiana out of there when we feel good about what Indiana is doing this offseason? Let's say, who's like the Northern team that like we're doubting now? Because like Jonathan Smith, we like the Jonathan Smith hire at Michigan State. Greg Schiano's kind of got it going at Rutgers a little bit. Is there nobody left to make fun? Oh, Iowa. I was gonna say, is there nobody left in the North to make fun of? So I do think there's a template there. And part of that is the roster building. Let's talk about the roster building of Michigan and what Michigan did. Who's Michigan's best player? Who's Michigan's best Heisman candidate? And I'm not even sure if that's the same thing.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Right. This is like we did the King of the North. We're officially, it's not the Knight of the North. It's the King of the North. It'd be the best player in Northern football. And we said we had 5 finalists at the end of the regular season. We are going to choose from those 5 finalists and hand that out in a week or so. We didn't have a Michigan guy in there because like we kind of didn't know who to pick. And I almost think we could do a quick version of this because I do think there's maybe worth wrapping up Washington and Michigan one more time beyond moments after the game. I would be curious how like our best 22 Michigan players draft would go because I'm not, I get it's probably Blake Corum, but like Blake Corum was better last year than he was this year. Like it might be Mason Graham as a defensive tackle. It might be Will Johnson as a corner. We both love Mike Sainer still. I mean, we maybe would have said Zach Zinter, who's maybe the best guard in college football. I think their offensive line might have gotten better after Zach Zinter was out, broke his leg and was out for the year in the Ohio State game. And I think that's part of this. It is they are so good, 1 through 44, too deep on both sides. And somebody in our company brought this up to us today, and it clarified for me a conversation we had on one of our 2 preview shows where we were talking about how Michigan and Washington built their rosters. It's the idea in brief, because this is like, we're going to do 15 shows on this in the offseason.
Yeah.
That is your sport a strong link sport or a weak link sport, which means is your success defined by the strength of your best players or the lack of weakness of your full roster? And the idea that probably the NBA is a strong link sport, right? Like, hey, man, you make a trade for a superstar, it can get you over the top. And I think maybe in the past, in the previous college football playoff era, with what the SEC was doing, Georgia and Alabama, and Ohio State to some degree, the consolidation of power and talent at the top 2, 3, 4, Clemson, 5 schools, it's like, well, how can anybody compete with that? They have all the best players. Now, portal, NIL, if that's flattened that out 20% maybe. It brings everybody up. If you're a school that recruits 5 stars, you might lose those guys after 3 years. If you can keep guys who are NFL players but not first rounders in school an extra year, you build, maybe you get more 4th and 5th year guys, and you have very good players throughout your roster. And maybe those very best schools that succeeded in the strong link world, maybe they now have more weak links because they're losing some of their highly recruited depth to the portal because those guys don't want to wait around. And the result is they're more elite at the top, but they have more weak links. I certainly think this applies to Ohio State this year with some of the weak links that we saw with Ohio State in certain areas. Did Michigan have as many elite players as Ohio State? No, I don't think so, although they had a bunch of good ones. We don't want to underrate Michigan's talent. But I think it's their depth. And if this is where we're going, and I think the offensive line is the best example of that. Jim Harbaugh talked about it. We talked about it. Everybody talked about it. I think they have 7 NFL offensive linemen. So they lose their best one, Zach Zinter, their right guard. The result is they kick in their right tackle, Carson Barnhart, who frankly wasn't a very good tackle.
Yeah.
They put in Trente Jones at right tackle. Barnhart's a more natural guard than he is a tackle. Jones plays great the last 3 games of the year, and they're probably better because when they lost an All-American offensive lineman, they had guys ready, man. They had guys ready. How many schools would that be the case where you lose an All-American offensive lineman and you're fine? I think that depth, Donovan Edwards as your second running back, right? Some of this stuff, I think their depth and their level of elite talent 1 through 22 as starters, not 1 through 5, but 1 through 22. Man, it's a separator from teams like them, but it's an elevator and allows them to say, okay, we don't have to recruit like Alabama or Georgia or Ohio State because we're going to retain our depth, coach it up, develop it. And by the way, they still recruit very, very well, just not 5-star mania.
Yeah, well, like Trente Jones is also a class of 2019 recruit, right? So it's not. I think a lot of teams nowadays, if not like the elite of the elite, if they would have found themselves in a similar situation, would have been throwing a true freshman out there. And Michigan didn't have to do that, and I think that is a separator. And I feel sustainable too for a program like
Mm-hmm.
Michigan. It's not like, unless they totally flip the script now that they've won a national championship and decided they want to try to build their roster in a totally different way than how they've done it throughout the entirety of their program. It feels like a sustainable model for a program like Michigan. And again, one that I think a lot of teams in the North could look at and say to themselves, like, we can do a version of this. Now, they have a 5-star quarterback, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there's they had a couple other 5 stars.
5-star corner, Will Johnson.
Yeah, well, 5-star corner and Will Johnson. So like I think you probably have to be able to sprinkle guys like that in from time to time. I don't even know if it needs to be like an every cycle kind of thing, but um, yeah, I don't know that we've ever considered like depth and balance to be like the preeminent traits of a national championship winner.
Yeah.
But I think that Michigan just showed us that it can be.
Yeah. And again, it's still very high level. If you think, oh, Michigan, oh, they don't recruit that well, you're wrong. But like they're 9th or 12th, they're not first or second. And then it's the depth of the talent that they do have. So I do think the way this roster was built it's a credit to them, sort of across the board again. And maybe just as a thought exercise, we can run through like a best 22 player Michigan draft just to check ourselves like how difficult it is and where we're finding those guys if we wrap up the season with that.
Yeah.
So I do want to talk about Washington here and whether I think I saw in the live show here comments on YouTube that somebody said like Washington's like the TCU of this season. I don't think that's true at all. I think the Pac-12 was a really tough conference to get through this year, and I do think they had some top end guys. I do think they won the Joe Moore Award as the best offensive line in the country, and then there were some things tonight that were like, should we revote on that a little bit? But the thing that everybody talked about, we talked about. I mean, their guards got destroyed by the Michigan defensive tackles, and then there was a little the tackles, the offensive tackles for Washington necessarily weren't great either. But I do think Washington, from the standpoint of getting steamrolled in the first half defensively, and in the second half, they made adjustments. Now, all of a sudden, it felt like their defensive linemen were eating up the blocks a little bit. The Michigan offensive linemen weren't getting to the second level as much. They were able to fit the runs a little bit better. And again, Michigan's not ever going to be super explosive in the pass game. I thought that adjustment by the Washington defense, I mean, they made it a game when it looked like they were going to get blown out. And all year, it's just been, is the defense good enough? I actually think for much of the game, like they were good enough. And then except it was the offense wasn't able to do its thing. I mean, Michigan scores 34. The last one doesn't really count. It's a desperation pick and run down to the 5-yard line. I mean, you're saying I thought if Washington got to 31, I think that was my score pick, 31-27. I thought like 30 was the magic number for Washington.
Yeah.
I think it would have been. And they couldn't get there. But I don't think this means they're a fraud, that their whole season's a fraud. And I don't think it means like there's an immense failure at play here beyond, or at least if there is, the failure starts with Michigan made Michael Penix uncomfortable. And when that and then there's a second part to it too. But I don't think this was like a collapse by Washington on a big stage.
No, I don't know that it was a collapse by Washington. The one thing that I had like a minor issue with for Washington was like Dylan Johnson was just like clearly not himself and not particularly effective. And he got 13 touches in this game. It just felt like every time they gave him the ball, it felt sort of like a waste of a play. And I don't mean it to come off as disparaging towards Dylan Johnson, because he was playing with a multitude of injuries and was really tough and like was trying to be there for his team. And I know that Washington doesn't have a ton of running back depth beyond him, and they were kind of depleted coming into the season anyway. But like there were some play calling decisions that I thought were a little odd to like put the ball in that guy's hands when I just didn't think there was going to be anything he could do that was going to be super effective. But no, I mean, Washington didn't play its A game for sure, but I don't come away from the game thinking like, oh, Washington was a fraud all year. They happened to play one of their worst games of the year in the national championship, which is unfortunate for them. But there's plenty of stuff throughout the year that I think shows that they were for real. Some big wins in a difficult league, and a couple against a really good team in Oregon. They beat Texas in the Sugar Bowl. Like none of that really feels fluky to me. So I would not put them in the TCU category. And partly too because like and I guess this could change rapidly, but I trust Kalen DeBoer's track record of a guy who just like doesn't lose a whole lot. So
Yeah.
they have some things they need to adjust here now as they move forward because they're losing some key pieces. But I don't think Washington's necessarily going away.
So, I mean, this wasn't like, so previously probably their worst game was Arizona State, right? They don't score an offensive touchdown. It's like,
Yeah.
well, like what is Arizona State doing to you to shut you down? You're doing that to yourself, right? I don't think the starts of themselves. We had talked about this a lot coming out. I think their balance was 57% throw, 43% run this season. I think they were 55-45 in the Bama game. I always said I like them 60-40. This game, they're 72% pass. Penix throws it 51 times. They only run it 20 times. Dylan Johnson, as you said, got it 11 times. And every time they handed it to him, I was like, what did you do that for? That was worthless.
Right.
So really the fact that he had said at media day a couple days ago, like, I'm going to play. He's clearly not himself. Like, bad news for him, right? It's 1 foot and 1 knee opposite coming into the game, and then he hurts the other foot on his first carry. So the guy can barely move. And then when we're talking about like depth of roster and that kind of thing, if Blake Corum gets hurt, Blake Corum couldn't play on the Ohio State game last year. What happened? Michigan played Donovan Edwards and ran for 200 yards. Like, we're fine.
Yeah.
Washington doesn't have that. So Washington, like the reason they played Dylan Johnson is because they didn't really have anybody else that they thought they could even give the ball to 6 times. So I did think I liked when they got to sort of later in the game, they're running bubble screens and tunnel screens and a couple things. They're flipping stuff to the tight end. That's a substitute for their run game. And every time they did that, I thought, well, that's better than trying to run it with a guy who's 50% at best.
Yeah.
But they got jammed up a little bit here. And I don't know, like second year Kalen DeBoer, Dylan Johnson's a transfer from Mississippi State who comes in and runs for 1,000 yards this year. He had never run for more than 500 there. Like they were grasping for running backs already. It's a little bit like what happened to Ohio State last year. Now, Ohio State had multiple injuries. Washington had 1. But if you can't hand it to somebody, like it does affect you. And I thought they tried to replicate some version of a run game the best they could. Again, those bubble screens and stuff count as passes. So like they're 72% pass, and should they have been 85% pass? I don't know what they were supposed to do, but I think it did throw them off because again, Dylan Johnson ran for 128 or 152 on 28 carries in the Pac-12 title game, and he wasn't that guy tonight.
He wasn't, but I feel like it shouldn't have surprised Washington either. The guy limped into the game. Like they seemed unprepared to handle losing him in the game, which like I think is inexcusable. And it's not to say that like there were easy answers for them to find if they said like, okay, what do we do if we don't have Dylan Johnson available? But that they had to kind of figure it out on the fly is surprising to me because it seemed like a likely ending point given all the injuries that Dylan Johnson had already incurred coming into this game, and then he gets hurt on the first play.
We will say, right, we saw Utah do it this year with Sione Vaki, right? He's a safety. They moved him to running back. He goes bonkers.
Yeah.
Ohio State did it last year with Chip Trainum, who was supposed to come to be a linebacker, even though he'd been a running back before. He becomes the lead back in the Michigan game. Should you just have a running back? I mean, a linebacker or a safety who is like, well, Dylan Johnson can't walk. I know you haven't played running back since your junior year of high school, but could you get ready in 8 days? Is that where, I mean, because sometimes there's athletes, man. Like, I mean, we can run through guys, right? If Ohio State back in the day had needed to turn linebacker Jerome Baker into a running back for a game, I think he probably could have done it with like maybe 3 practices. So we're saying maybe Washington should have found a defensive guy.
Yeah, or like I don't know. There were times last year when Ohio State was going through its thing where I thought like they should just put Emeka Egbuka at running back.
Yeah.
Washington just to put like Jalen McMillan at running back.
Maybe. We can ask Kalen DeBoer that when we have him on in the offseason. So I think Washington tried and they got themselves back in the game, and Michigan's defense is pretty tough. And if you would have gotten the A+ Penix game, Washington's right there. If you got A+, but Michigan kind of was going to say, you're not getting A-plus Penix. And now for Washington going forward, we know Dylan Morris, like the backup quarterback, is transferring out. Not a surprise. They have Austin Mack as the young guy, the early enrolled freshman who was in there this season. And now they have Will Rogers coming in from Mississippi State. So we'll see how they balance that. You can't expect that anyone's going to be Michael Penix, but what can they do? And nobody's going to be Rome Odunze. What
Right.
can you do to take the best of what they've been? And again, I think we did their top 35 players, 31 were 4th, 5th, and 6th-year players. This is going to be a little bit of a reset for them, but I think they have the game plan for what they want to get back to. Maybe not in 2024, but maybe in 2025 or 2026. But I think it's reasonable, right? All the excitement in the world for the Big Ten to be adding USC, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon next year. You're not getting this Washington. And by the way, these teams are going to play each other again. Washington and Michigan are on the schedule for each other in 2024, but we can't hold Washington yet to the same standard that I think it's fair to hold Michigan, that it's fair to hold Ohio State, where it's like there's an expectation that you should be able to do this every year. It's Michigan at Washington, October 5th next season. Probably going to be a couple losses on the schedule for the Huskies.
Yeah, probably. Well, it'll be a good test, I guess. I'd be interested what I mean, maybe you'd have to give Caleb DeBoer truth serum to get the real answer out of him, like what his expectations are in terms of moving forward from this season. Because like obviously they'd like to be right back here again, but how realistic is that for their program, or what does he think they need to have in place for them to actually be a team that shows up in the playoff year after year? Because they had not been that prior to this. They had been in the playoff before, but that was what, in 2018? Is that when the last time they were there? When they had Jake Browning?
Yeah, I got to
Or
go
15
back and check. 15 or 16. It was 15 or 16.
Yeah, so like then, so it had been that long since they had been on the stage. Like, I don't think you want to be in that position where you're waiting another 8 or 9 years before you're back in the college football playoff. If it's a temporary dip kind of out of that sort of relevancy as you build the roster back up and then you're back in it in 25 and 26, I think that's okay. But again, like I said, I'm not necessarily going to write Washington off, because Caleb DeBoer's win-loss record in his career is insane. So if they find the way to rip off 10 wins next year, I don't think I'd be surprised by that. I wouldn't predict it right as we sit here right now with all they're losing, but there's a track record there that I trust with that coaching staff, so I'm not going to be surprised if it happens.
I mean, there's a part of me that's like, there's some places that where you can't take a step back here. You just can't. The expectation, the possibility, especially in a 12-team playoff, is always there. I do think it's very reasonable for Washington to have a step back year next year and build towards something, right? Which is why I'm very curious to see how they handle the quarterback situation, for example. They will start Weber State at home is the opener, then Eastern Michigan, then the Apple Cup early in the year. God bless Washington and Washington State for saving the Apple Cup. And then the first Big Ten game for Washington is at home versus Northwestern on September 21st. Then they're at Rutgers, hosting Michigan on October 5th, at Iowa, at Indiana, USC, at Penn State, UCLA, and at Oregon. So again, they're coming, it's like a new world. They're coming to the Big Ten. 3 of their 9 Big Ten games are against teams they played in the Pac-12. So it's not all that new. So, okay. But congrats to Washington on a great year, right? I mean, my gosh. What a great year. And there's a version of this. You and I both picked Washington to win this game. Like it wasn't maximum Penix, so then it wasn't going to happen. But like, I don't feel ridiculous. Well, I don't know. I know I would be fair. I say when I feel ridiculous for when I make actually like 100% ridiculous picks and prognostications. I'm not feeling that way tonight, because I still can see the path, how it could have happened, right? Like, as you think about, you picked Washington to win, it's just, hey man, kudos to the Michigan defense for the way they made it tough on them. But do you feel silly that you picked Washington?
No, I don't feel silly, because like I said, I thought even with as well as Michigan's defense played, like I do think Michael Penix got a little outside of himself in this game, and I wasn't expecting that, which is why I picked Washington to win. And I wonder, like, Washington's offense feels a lot like a momentum thing, where if they get that first touchdown, they kind of get rolling. I thought the play early in the game in the end zone to Rome Odunze, when like Keon Sabb, I think, was covering him, and there was like a little bit of contact there, and I think Michael Penix sort of threw it high. there was an opening there to complete a touchdown pass. And like, I'll wonder if that was completed, maybe how the tenor of the game changes. But no, I don't feel silly. I'll certainly own being wrong. I thought it was going to be a case of Washington being able to muster more explosive plays than Michigan could. And that, it was flipped. It was the other way around.
Okay. Let's talk about Michigan's future, Jim Harbaugh's future, and everything that goes into that. And it's where maybe we could have started, but we wanted to talk about the football, and now we want to talk about the legacy of this Michigan season. 144th Michigan season, as we said, 12th national title for Michigan, the 10th time they've won a national title with an unbeaten, untied record. I think maybe inarguably the greatest season in Michigan football history. Rich Rodriguez was 15-22 in 3 seasons at Michigan. Brady Hoke was 31-20 in 4 seasons at Michigan. Jim Harbaugh in his first 6 seasons at Michigan was 49-22, which is quite a step up. He in Jim Harbaugh's first 6 seasons at Michigan, he had the same number of losses that Rich Rodriguez had in 3. He also had 34 more wins. So that's how much of a step up that is. Come and right the ship of your alma mater. But now in the last 3 seasons, Jim Harbaugh is 40-3 in the last 3 seasons at Michigan with the national championship. He's now 89-25 overall as the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines. And I will be shocked if it's not his last game as the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines, because for a multitude of reasons. But I think number one, actually, is that he did what he came to do.
Yes.
He came home as the prodigal son to restore Michigan's rightful place in the college football hierarchy. And that has been accomplished. So what else is there? It's only downhill from here. And then you throw in the fact that there's just a lot of NFL in him. Everybody, I think, has seen that. And you throw in 2 different off-season rule-breaking situations that led to 2 separate suspensions of Jim Harbaugh this past season. Those are not over. And then you add in the fact that the NFL is going to throw boatloads of money at him. So did what he can to do, NFL inclination, NCAA stuff, and moolah. How can he stay? Do you agree with that idea? We are far from the most appropriate, sophisticated, knowledgeable people to discuss Jim Harbaugh's future. But come on, bro.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I would be pretty shocked if this was not the last game we saw from Jim Harbaugh for all the reasons that you stated. And he's 60, right?
He's 60. He just turned 60, I think.
And like, like Pete Carroll's up there and he's still coaching the NFL, but now like the only thing that's left for Harbaugh to do is go win a Super Bowl.
Yep.
And he's going to have the opportunity to do it. I would think this offseason, there's probably 3 or 4 teams that I think would like to have him as their head coach. I would be absolutely stunned if he doesn't take one of those jobs.
If John Harbaugh and the Ravens win the Super Bowl, will this be the best year that any pair of brothers has had since Orville and Wilbur Wright threw the plane? Like, I mean, like 2? I mean, they both those guys were like up in the air, right? Or it was only one of them. Actually, I don't even know that. They're from Ohio, but they did in North Carolina. Were they both on the plane? Or you probably wouldn't have both on the initial plane. It would weigh it down. You only need one. It's not like there's 2 guys up there, one guy sitting in coach, one in first class, right?
I also feel like you need that's like the designated survivor situation too. Like you're going to put them both up there. It just feels dangerous.
If Jim and John Harbaugh had invented flight, which one would have been in the plane and what? Jim Harbaugh.
Jim Harbaugh's on the plane. What do you mean which one would have been on the plane?
John and Jim both would have wanted Jim in the plane. There's no doubt about that. So this opportunity for the Harbaughs and what Jim Harbaugh has accomplished, my bet is that Sherrone Moore is the coach of the Michigan Wolverines next season.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And how could they go anywhere else? With all the things that we just said about Sherrone Moore, from a schematic standpoint, from a recruiting standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, what he did, it's very much like the Ryan Day situation. Ryan Day was the head coach for 3 games in 2018 while Urban Meyer was suspended. You got a sense of him. The AD, Gene Smith, got a sense of him. Of course, Ward Manuel got a sense of Sherrone Moore here. I mean, there's not another option. They wouldn't. There's no need to go outside. I think there'd probably be a revolt if they went outside. This guy's been integral to the success they've had.
I guess there's two things, which I think I mentioned before, is like if somehow Sherrone Moore gets spun up in something that we're not expecting NCAA wise, but also to like, I don't, there's, if Sherrone Moore's life goal has been to coach in the NFL and Jim Harbaugh says, hey, do you want to come be my coordinator with the Chargers? Maybe he would do that instead of being Michigan's head coach. I don't know. It's like, cause he's not a Michigan alum, so he doesn't have that same pull, obviously, that Jim Harbaugh would have had. But short of those two things, yeah, I don't think there's a scenario where Sherrone Moore is not the head coach of Michigan.
So do you agree with this? Putting people in places next year. Jim Harbaugh is the head coach of either the Raiders or the Chargers.
Yeah.
Jesse Minter is his NFL defensive coordinator, and Sherrone Moore is the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines.
Yeah, I buy all that.
Which is quite a reset for Michigan. Yeah. So then let's talk about the legacy of this season, the legacy of Jim Harbaugh. Will Jim Harbaugh have a statue on Michigan's campus at some point?
Yes.
He will. I completely agree with that. It certainly is possible that there is more to come with an NCAA investigation into the sign stealing. What has happened so far is the Big Ten took action based on what they knew at the time, but that wasn't the end all be all. It was never, everybody knows that. It wasn't assumed to be the end all be all. It was sort of like a half step in the moment. And again, I think it was an appropriate half step. I don't think there was enough information in the moment to rise to the level of banning Michigan from a Big Ten championship game of something like that. I do think the suspension of a head coach for the last 3 games of the regular season, including against Ohio State, was a legitimate penalty. And so, but I also think something should have been done. I thought they landed in the right spot. We don't have to relitigate that. Do you believe this story and therefore the legacy of this season is as yet not fully written?
Oh yeah, no, I don't think it is. Yeah, I think there's something has to come out about the sign stealing stuff. We know that they got a notice of allegations for the other stuff,
right?
But not for this yet. So that shoe needs to drop, and I think it could be, a rather big bomb. Like, do you think it could be too? Like, I'm not saying Michigan's going to get the death penalty, but I think there could be some fairly hefty sanctions that come with that.
I don't. That's not what this show is primarily about. I think when you have if you believe that you've gained an on-field advantage, I think like on-field penalty, I think there could be like a postseason ban, possibly like for a year. I would not be shocked by that because again, I don't think you would lean as much toward like scholarship reduction and those kind of things because that like punishes players and this is not the doing of players, right? This is the doing of adults. So I think that's possible. I don't think that this will be vacated. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, like on a small percentage chance, maybe. But I also don't think Michigan's taking the banner down, if it is anyway.
So I don't think the NCAA is as interested in of being in the business of vacating past titles as they once were.
Yeah.
So I don't think that will happen. Do you think what is your analysis right now in this moment of how sign stealing may have affected Michigan's on-field success in this 3-year era where they are 40-3 on the field and then specifically this championship season?
I think it helped them take their step forward. I don't know that I would say it's the chief reason they took their step forward. And I'm of the mind that when they got caught, they stopped and then they won all their best games and the biggest games and they won the national championship. So I don't think that it was tremendously impactful on the way that this season ended, or really impactful at all, if I'm being honest.
So I do think there's some nuance in there of I think we're agreeing sign stealing did not help them beat Ohio State, Iowa, Alabama, Washington, the 4 games that were the keys to them winning the national championship. Sign stealing may have helped them win previous games this season or games in 2022 and 2021.
Yeah.
You can both be a very, very talented, well-coached football team and be a team that broke the rules to gain an advantage. Those things can absolutely are, I think, true together in this moment. It doesn't mean that Michigan's not good. It doesn't mean that Michigan didn't win these last 4 games fair and square. There may have been, but they may have been, as you said, lifted to this level a bit by that. So I think in the end, this will be one of those things which I think happens a lot in college football. Jim Tressel left Ohio State under pressure of NCAA violations and sanctions and was back the next year hoisted on the shoulders of his former players in a celebration of a national championship season. Now, obviously, time has affected it, I think, rightly so in many ways, but also still rules broken in that moment were rules that were broken. Nobody around Ohio State has bad feelings about Jim Tressel. And if people on the outside, I think, call Jim Tressel a cheater, I think Ohio State people get their back up. And I think it is, and that's just one example, right? And I think there will be a Jim Harbaugh statue. Jim Harbaugh's legacy as a Michigan man, as a Michigan winner, will be as great as anybody in the history of Michigan athletics. And this is a long, distinguished history, but I think you put him up there with Bo Schembechler. I think you put him up there with Fritz Chrysler. I think you put him up there with Fielding Yost because of everything he did as a player and as a coach. And he is an absolute all-time, make the Mount Rushmore of Michigan athletics. And Jim Harbaugh is on it, and there will be a statue and very probably a Harbaugh building somewhere.
Yep.
And Ohio State fans and another chunk of college football fans in general will always look at the 2023 Michigan season and say they cheated to win.
Yeah. Hey, that's right.
So is there a solution beyond that? And is that just how college sports works? You love your own guy, and then you think everybody else is a dirty, rotten cheater. Is this? I mean, that's and that I hope, right? We're maybe scooting towards the end of that era in a world where we're paying players and maybe doesn't mean rules will never be broken again. But maybe is this the last greatest incident of this? Of our guy, legendary winner, other people think he's a dirty, rotten cheater. Maybe never again quite as stark as the Harbaugh Michigan legacy will be.
Yeah, I don't know if it'll ever be this stark. And the difference with this, it's not different from all of them, but take Alabama, for instance. I'm sure there are a lot of people that say Nick Saban cheated his way to his national titles because of recruiting improprieties or whatever. There's no proof of that. He's never gotten caught doing anything. Michigan got caught.
Yeah.
Michigan has already been punished and will likely be punished more. So that makes it different. It's not just you lobbing unfounded insults at the team that you hate. There's proof and perhaps even more of it to come out to support your assertion that Michigan cheated to get to this position. So that will make it even worse. I think that will make it hard to replicate, I think, in the future. So I think, yeah, especially when it comes the roster building side of cheating, I think a lot of that is going to be hard to get super up in arms about as it becomes more and more of a gray area. Michigan bending the rules or outright ignoring them and breaking them to gain an on-field advantage is a little more black and white, and I think makes it different.
And listen, I think that applies to anybody in this situation. If there's anything concrete that comes out again, right, of this team or this guy cheated, then it applies it applies to that school and that coach as well. But I think in the end, and we were already having it a little bit in our YouTube chat, if you're not a Michigan fan and your view of Jim Harbaugh is that he's a cheater, it's like, okay, I think you're probably right. If you are a Michigan fan and your view of Jim Harbaugh is that he's a legend and a winner, I think you're probably right.
You're right. Yeah.
So, and I don't think that's a cop out, because you're either both right or you can just fight to the death.
Right.
Like what are you going to decide? The thing I think you can't say is that they won only because they cheated. And
Right.
so like that idea of, and that it felt like right the very first game when after the allegations came out, like they come out and they're playing Michigan State like the next day, and Michigan State's like, we have to whisper our signals to each other because of this Connor Stallions guy is wearing a mustache in the stands. But then the next week against Purdue, they thumped Purdue, and it felt like they were trying to say, that's not why we won. So like that, if they would have fallen apart, right, and lost 2 of their last 3 games and gotten drilled by Ohio State, it would have been like, okay,
Right.
this was all sign stealing. So it's not that. But it doesn't mean like, so you reinforced that you are actually good at football. Good players, good coaches, good scheme, good fundamental discipline, make all the necessary plays. It doesn't mean you didn't cheat before, though.
Yeah.
But it just means that's not the only reason you won. So I do think there is some slice in that I think some people may have trouble finding common ground on. But I would say that if someone said they only won, that's the only time I would ever say to anybody in this scenario, no, you're wrong, is if someone said that's the only reason they were good. I think that's been proven wrong.
I think, yeah, I know. I think so too. Like, honestly, I was like kind of waiting for it to happen. Like, not necessarily waiting for them to lose to like Michigan State or Purdue, but like when they played at Penn State, I was like, oh, this could be the start of us really raising an eyebrow at what Michigan has been over the last 2.5 years, and like it was almost the opposite of that. It was not impressive. Again, I'm not trying to give Michigan credit for overcoming adversity that it created. But I do think it did what it had to do after all this came out, and the teams that had left on that schedule to beat, and now obviously that it's won a national championship to show that this was not all about them cheating to get to this point. Like they're well coached, and there's really good football players on that team. They just also might happen to be cheaters as well.
We'll get Harbaugh on and ask him about it. Jim, what would you say? All right, that'll wrap up here our live post-game show. So we start a show called Kings of the North, and in that season, we get a Northern National Championship game and a Northern National Champion. So I think we started this, Bill, with the intention of reminding people that Northern football is good, that it's not only about the South. I think it's twofold. A, that Northern football is good, and that B, Northern football really matters to people just as much as it matters to people in the South. It's twofold. Players and fans, right? Performance and passion. I think that's what we want this show to be, both sides of it. Culturally, how it fits in, on the field, how good it is. I did not expect necessarily like this to happen right away, but I'm also not exactly shocked by it. But I think it makes our job a little easier here, because we wouldn't be doing a post-game show if it was Florida State, Georgia.
Right.
But I think we saw it coming a little bit, right? I mean, I think we had an idea that this could be true, especially as you divide into these two conferences. And so I don't think this is going away. And we're going to do a lot in the offseason, contextualizing all the teams that matter in the North. But that here in sort of our soft launch of a first season, we're ending with this. It's a pleasant surprise, and it's a little bit of a reinforcement of why we're here to begin with.
Yeah, well, I think a point worth making is like the passion for Northern football, and the things that make it different. I think from the passion for Southern football that we wanted to celebrate, like that existed in the 25 years in which there were only 3 Northern national champions, right? So we would be doing this. We would be doing this either way. But I also think we had an inkling, and like I'm not trying to say like we told you so, but I think we had an inkling that the ground was shifting a little bit, and that maybe the sport was changing in a way where Northern teams are going to become more nationally competitive more often than they have been. And we wanted to be around to celebrate that as well. So that second part happened quicker, definitely. And we'll talk about the sustainability of it now until the start of next season. But it wasn't only about that. That almost ends up sort of like being a nice cherry on top of what we initially set out to, which is just to like remind people that college football is not merely a Southern sport. And you got a really good reminder of that tonight when a Northern team won the national title.
We wanted to celebrate like the kings of the North because so often they weren't the kings of the whole world. Right. And we wanted to say, hey, like being the best team in the North, there's actually matters because there are challenges up here, because maybe there are guardrails up here that don't exist in the South. And so just because you maybe can't beat the South doesn't mean you're not a great program, doesn't mean you don't have a great fan base. And so I think that was, but then also sometimes the king of the North, like rides into the South and cuts off everybody's head, and then you're the king of everything. So like that happened this year. Michigan just rode down and Jim Harbaugh cut off everybody's head. Even if Connor Stallions helped sharpen his sword. You know what I'm saying? So like, what are you going to do? All right. Thanks to everybody who took part in our inaugural soft launch season for Kings of the North. This is it. This is the end of this. Well, no, it's not. We're going to do a couple other things maybe to wrap up a little bit. And then we're going to start contextualizing, looking ahead. As we said a million times, we want to have players. We want to have coaches. We want to have experts on a bunch of different Northern teams on this show. We want to bring in different voices. We have grand plans for what we're doing here. And I don't mean like to get out over our skis, Bill, but like I was on Sirius XM, like the Big Ten channel, with a couple of the Big Ten guys over there. And I was like explaining the concept of the show to them. And they were like, yeah, send me swag. And I went back to my old stomping grounds on the College Football Survivor show to talk about the North last week. And I feel like when we do explain the idea to people, sometimes you have to puncture the balloon a little bit to like wake them up. But then once they get their hands around it, they're kind of like, yeah, actually, I don't think that exists. And I kind of think it should. So we wanted to keep doing that for people to A, help explain it, and then B, tell you why it's relevant. And we'll spend the next 6 months doing that until we get to conference previews in July.
Yeah. Well, yeah, conference previews, spring ball is like 4 weeks away.
Yeah. No, so like again, in the end, if you guys don't know it, this is going to be a 5-day-a-week show. So it's not going to be a 5-day-a-week show until the summer, until we're really into the previews of the season and conference media days and that kind of thing. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to keep doing this once, twice, who knows how many times a week. And that means recruiting. That means coaching changes. That means spring football. That means everything. So if you've been here, great. If you're new, great. And thanks for making all of it possible. But we got a Northern National champion. And again, I do think we're not naive. Not everybody in the North is celebrating Michigan's national title. But I, like even within that, and it is very hard for Ohio State fans. I obviously you don't have to explain that to Ohio State fans. But like, I think there's a tiny sliver. I think of like, okay, well, like at least it shows that what we're doing up here is good enough. And there's something in that, even if you hate the team that won on Monday night, it's a little bit of a reinforcement that if the last 25 years have made you think, man, I don't know, we're a tier down. There's another place that dominates and it's not here. I think it should be reassuring when somebody in your backyard is the best, even if you hate them.
I personally would have a hard time coming around to that logic, so I'm not going to tell all the people that. I guess I would just don't celebrate that Michigan won. Just celebrate that the South lost.
Yes, I think that's right. And it is a little different. We're not asking for Big Ten chants because like the SEC, they'll do an SEC chant. And it's like nobody in Ohio was doing a Big Ten chant during during the game. But you could, even if you whispered to yourself that as you watch two Northern teams, just whisper to yourself, the South can cram it.
Yeah.
You know, the South can cram it. You can still hate Michigan, but also they can live together. You hate Michigan. Michigan hates Ohio State. Also, the South can cram it. That'll do it for Kings of the North. Thanks to our producer, Mike Urostowski. Thanks to everybody who watched us live on YouTube. Thanks to everybody watching back on YouTube. Thanks to everybody listening on a podcast. We're in your podcast feeds. We're on YouTube. And we're so excited that you're here. And we can't wait for what's next for this show and for Northern football fans across the country. For now, he is Bill Landis. I'm Doug Lesmerises. Michigan, 15-0, the national champions with a 34-13 win over Washington. And that was Kings of the North.